Welcome to the Straight No Chaser podcast, where we talk about human freedom and flourishing through technology, money, economics, and philosophy. Today's show, we talk to Ivo Vegter about free markets and the differences between the US President Donald Trump and the Argentinian President Javier Milei. Ivo has a background in technology and journalism and writes for the Institute of Race Relations and their newsletter, The Daily Friend. I started becoming aware of Ivo's writings through the Daily Friend newsletter and also on Twitter, where he spends a lot of time uploading articles and commenting on the state of affairs. I haven't always agreed with his point of view, but I've always found a lot to learn from what he has to say. So I really look forward to this conversation, and I know you will too. But welcome, Ivo. Great to have you on the podcast. And
thank you, Gavin.
I think people enjoy stories, and I think the best story is sort of always someone's personal story. So could I ask you just to introduce yourself to the audience, give us a little bit about the background, any part that you're comfortable to share, and just how did you end up as a journalist covering the topics, interested in the topics that you're interested in right now?
I'll do that. The short answer is by accident. The long answer is I was born in Holland. Actually, my name is Ivo Vegter. I'm a columnist at the moment for the Daily Friend, which is the journal of the Institute of Race Relations. And the Daily Friend has a strong classical liberal bent. You know, they promote non-racialism and classical liberal principles, including free markets and so on. So I'm very at home there at the moment. Love working for them. How I got there is a very long story. I'm going to make it short as I can. I actually studied computer science, mathematics, and applied mathematics. Never quite finished my degree, although I did get quite far. I then got an offer to write for a company, and I'd never written anything before. You know, I hadn't done English or didn't know I could write. But they said, look, if you come up to Joburg, we'll triple your salary, and we'll give you some cool tech toys to work with, and as long as you write about them afterwards. Now, if you tell me to come and play with tech toys, then, I'm there. So that's what happened. I became a product reviewer for a magazine at the time called PC Report back in the early 90s. And from there, I became a tech journalist, technology journalist. And I had to learn quite a lot quite quickly about how companies worked, how their annual reports came together, how their financials worked. I had to understand the dot-com boom because everyone was talking about, this is a new economy, and all the old rules don't matter anymore. They don't count. It's all about eyeballs and not about revenue. None of this made any sense. Some of these companies were trading at massive PE ratios, and the whole new economy shtick didn't make sense to me. So I started reading economics in my spare time, and eventually got to make quite a bit of sense out of what was happening with the stock market back during the dot-com boom, and then later the telecoms boom, and I started writing about some of that stuff. By the mid 2000s, I was working with a guy called Branko Brkic. He'd been my editor at Brainstorm magazine. And then he launched Maverick magazine in print in the mid 2000s, and he asked me to be a columnist for Maverick magazine. That didn't work so well. The market in South Africa is not very deep. It's print is expensive, so he took that online in 2009, and I became the first opinionista for Daily Maverick. I had a great time there for more than 10 years. One of the highlights probably was covering the Karoo shale gas fracking controversy which was fascinating. I learned a hell of a lot about geology. I learned a hell of a lot about oil and gas industry, about the economics of oil and gas. And I had a really good time traveling through the Karoo and actually, covering the story in a lot of detail for a few years. Then by about 2020, I was feeling that I wasn't really so at home at Daily Maverick anymore. They were, the bigger they grew, the more of a sort of soft left, almost woke editorial position they took. And I wasn't really comfortable with that. I was sort of the only holdout of classical libertarianism, of free market theories. So I looked around, and someone pointed me to the IRR, and they wanted to launch a publication initially for their members, and it became much bigger than that in the end. And they asked me to write for them, and I thought, this is actually a really nice idea. So that's where I am now. I'm writing twice a week for the IRR. I also write research reports on my off days on various topics, and that's how I got to be where I am now.
Okay, so that's like really fascinating. So you started in mathematics and technology, and then moved into journalism. So as far as libertarian thinking goes, where was the first time that you realized, or maybe you can explain to the audience who haven't heard about libertarian thinking and economics, maybe just talk a little bit about that.
I got into touch with a few people who sort of on the libertarian scene, Leon Lowe being probably the most prominent, who was at the Free Market Foundation at the time. That was around the year 2000, probably, give or take a couple of years. And this was at the time that I was trying to understand how economic booms and busts work, and what causes them. Why is there not just a lot of market hysteria and excitement around certain technologies, but where does that money come from? How do these asset prices inflate the way they do? And once I started reading, free market economists like Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, they had a very good explanation for how this worked. And this was basically based on the Keynesian orthodoxy of inflationary monetary policy, that easy money, low interest rates, and printing money, of which we've seen a lot in the last 20 years, that inevitably raises prices. Now, initially, it doesn't raise consumer prices, but it raises asset prices, because that extra money that gets pumped into the economy. I mean, the theory is that a central bank ought to print enough money to account for an economy's growth. Right? So as the economy grows, you need more money, and this is just a practical need. Now, this could be done in a purely private market, just by banks. But in a central bank, that is what you want to do. You want to basically increase the money supply equivalent to the amount of growth that you get. But central banks never do that. They always create more money than that. They're always late with tightening interest rates. They are late with loosening interest rates when things get bad. So this is really that extra money that is now competing for the same amount of goods and services in the economy. If increases prices, it has to increase prices, and that is first seen because of the way that market is structured. Because the money first goes into the top end of the banking system, that gets pushed into assets, properties, housing. This is where the housing bubble came from, and stocks. This is where stock market booms come from. Only once it becomes egregious, like we've seen after COVID, with the massive quantitative easing during the COVID period, only after that does it eventually reflect in consumer prices. And we saw consumer inflation go up a couple of years ago. It's back under control, has been for about a year or so globally. But this is the theory that to me made a lot of sense. And when you start looking at the motivation behind it, that people's value judgments are subjective. A government cannot make value judgments for you. Right? A government can't decide what you need. You need this thing more than you need that thing. The government doesn't know, doesn't have that information. A government doesn't have enough information to decide what ought to be produced and how it ought to be produced, and where it ought to be produced. So that, it made a lot of sense to me, and I sort of gravitated very quickly to the view that free markets are ideal, that government is not entirely unnecessary, but it should be small. And very limited in what it does, basically protecting life, liberty, and property. That individual liberty should be the sort of moral compass for political and economic policy.
Yeah, you've said so much there, and there's so much to unpack. Before I come to the what you're speaking about, centrally planned economies and that, just coming back to your interest in libertarian thinking, do you think it had something to do with the fact that you were mathematically, like a maths guy, you were busy studying mathematics or applied mathematics, that having to understand mathematics as a logic, and there's a way it works, and you can't sort of fudge the numbers, so to speak. Do you think that natural inclination towards maths made sense when you looked at libertarian thinking as cause and effect in that kind of sense?
Yes and no. Yes, it obviously did give me a sort of background in very rigorous thinking. Where you look objectively at facts and you make logical deductions from those facts. So from that perspective, yes, it turned me into a logical and critical thinker. But from another perspective, not really. A lot of modern economics is very mathematical. It's very based on data and gathering data, analyzing that data, and then trying to make predictions on what the economy will do, and trying to set policies to control the economy based on all of that historical data that you've got. The libertarian writers, especially the Austrian school, they don't really buy this. They don't think of economics as a science, as a natural science, so much as it is a theory of human behavior, a theory of human action. And that is, I think, the key sort of insight that you need to get to understand Austrian school libertarian style economics, is that it's about how people behave and the choices that people make. And that, I think, I got more from reading history, which I did a lot since I left university as well. I have a great interest in history. You need to understand how people behave, because people aren't numbers. If they were, then you could have a centrally planned economy. And then all you need, if it didn't work 50 or 100 years ago, then all you need is more powerful computers to plan your resource allocation and so on, and produce what people want and need. But people aren't numbers. You can never, no matter how much you know, and no matter how much you throw at it, you can never determine what people want and need at any particular time, and what the best way is to produce that. And that's really an insight, I think, that comes more from history and perhaps psychology than from mathematics and the natural sciences.
Okay. So you've mentioned, I think, centrally planned economies at least once or twice, and coming back to value as being subjective. So I think we've had examples in the past where we've got centrally planned economies, typically under the communism banner, where governments have tried to do what you were saying is impossible for any government to do, and that is to determine what each individual person needs at any point in time, and those needs are constantly changing as well. So would you agree with that is probably underpinning where communism itself, as trying to be centrally planned, falls flat?
Yes, I think that's where it fails. I think a lot of people say, well, no, real socialism has never been tried. And every time you point to a failure of socialism, they say, oh, but they didn't do it the right way. Stalin was never supposed to be, it was never supposed to be a dictatorship. They come up with all these arguments, but once you start thinking about it, the only way that a government can centrally plan resource allocation and centrally plan what gets produced in an economy is through dictatorship, is through totalitarianism. They have to control individuals. They have to control what I do for work, what I produce, and how much of it I produce. They control then also what I consume, what I get to consume, or at least how much I get to consume. They might not be able to prescribe potatoes instead of beans, but they can limit me to 10 rand a day for food. So the tendency towards totalitarianism, I think, is inherent in the socialist notion that the factors of production ought to be controlled by the state on behalf of the people. And there's never been an example where the people can directly control them without the intervention of an agent like the state. So I don't even understand how that would work other than in perhaps a small commune type situation.
So I've definitely heard the argument about socialism in the past. As you say, it's never been implemented correctly, and everyone thinks they have the best way to implement socialism. I have also heard people saying that capitalism has not been implemented as it should be either, and that our economy is perhaps not as free, our markets are not as free as we think it is. And it comes back to something you mentioned earlier about central banks and money printing. Would you say that there is some strength to that argument, that while there's an organization called the central bank that determines interest rates and the money supply, it is the same thing? We have a centrally planned money economy, if I could call it that.
Yes, I would agree with that. And it's a bit of a conundrum, because ultimately it's quite hard to solve the problem. But I absolutely agree that real capitalism. I don't like the word capitalism, by the way. It was a word introduced by Marx, actually by Marx's predecessors, but it was used by Marx more of as a critique of the current system. And he was, at the time, he was really writing about the mercantilist sort of system. I prefer to talk about free markets. And if you look at free markets, well, there are examples of countries that have fairly free markets. Some of them, Hong Kong, for example, the small services trading countries, those have very free markets. But I don't think that there's really been a great example of a properly constructed free market economy with a minimal state. And it's the problem is that a state tends to grow. And I'm going to go off a bit on a tangent here, because there's a reason why states grow. And that is because politicians tend to campaign in a democracy, that is, on the basis of what they can do for certain interest groups, for their constituencies. And they're going to say, look, okay, you are mine workers. We're going to make sure that you have a minimum wage. We're going to make sure that foreign imports can't compete with your products, so that you'll have, the mines will do better, and we'll protect the mining industry that way. They offer that. Offering the opposite, right, saying that we're not going to give you any protection, we're going to expose you to all the foreign competition that we can get, is not a very appealing message to send as a politician. So the way that democracy is structured ends up creating larger and larger governments. Then governments decide, well, they need the power to tax. How do they get the power to tax? Well, if they let the economy free, they won't know what you earn. They won't know who does what. So how are they going to tax people? And this is where a centrally issued currency as sole legal tender becomes important, because that is the means by which governments tax their citizens, and thereby perpetuate themselves. And of course, the more they tax, the more they're able to say, all right, well, we're going to give you freebies, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And I don't mind a minimal welfare state. I say, look, we're going to look after the 2% or 5% of people who really can't work for themselves, can't look after themselves. Got no problem with society deciding that these people need to be looked after. But it becomes much more than that, right? Now, suddenly you have a right to free electricity, and a right to free housing, and a right to education, and a right to all sorts of things that cost someone, somewhere, effort and time and money to produce. And this becomes problematic, because the bigger that grows, the more you end up working for other people rather than for yourself. And there's a moral problem with governments growing too big that way.
Yeah, I think that dovetails really nicely into something I wanted to ask you about, and that is a recent article that you have done comparing Javier Milei in Argentina to Donald Trump. And really interesting. And I think the background is, as I understand, there was an expression about as wealthy as an Argentine, probably
Yes.
about 100 years ago or so, when Argentina was probably in the top 10 wealthiest countries in the world. And they seem to be doing quite well. And then that didn't last. Now, obviously, on your article, you've done some research into Argentina. You probably understand their backstory better than I do. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the Argentine backstory to set the stage for Javier Milei, how he has come in, and what that means as an example, possibly to the rest of the world, that like an Austrian economist president.
Yeah, that's Milei is a really remarkable character. Unlike Trump, I have a lot of issues with Trump, and we can get into that, if you want. But Milei is a fascinating character. I think he is probably the most economically qualified world leader that we've ever seen. Argentina, you're right. Argentina was very rich in the late 19th century and going into the early 20th century. A number of things then ended up happening. Worldwide, there was this move towards socialism, and this affected Argentina as well. You saw in the Soviet Union what became the Soviet Union in Russia then. You had the Bolshevik Revolution, but socialism was really on the march throughout the world in many ways. And that ended up happening in Argentina as well. And they ended up with many years of very socialist, dirigist, controlling, almost fascist governments, occasionally alternated with military dictatorships. The most significant of those, of course, were under Juan Perón and what then became known as the Peronists. And the Peronists are still a party in Argentina. And they basically had a very similar economic view that the ANC has. They believe in state-led growth. They believe that the state needs to look after the people, that they have a very almost patriarchal view of the state, the relationship of the state to the people. They believe in socialism. They were very corrupt. So, there was a lot of cronyism going on. You had big industries in Argentina, but they were big industries by virtue of the government power that they could pervert, in their favor. They had very high import tariffs because they didn't believe in foreign competition. They wanted to create domestic industries, protect domestic industries and domestic farming. And the consequences of that were decades of very low growth and bouts of very high inflation. And this is the sort of background into which Milei suddenly burst onto the scene. And the Peronists had been weakened a bit before Milei came around. They had a conservative president called Macri. I can't remember his first name now, but he was one of the guys who said, "Look, we're going to do gradual reform." He didn't want to rock the boat too much. He knew that his majority was only slim, and he was afraid to do too much, and that didn't work. He ended up having to go back to the IMF, and it was a disaster, and that let the Peronists back into power. And this is then the presidency that Milei campaigned against. So he came in and he said, "Look, we're going to cut the size of government. We're going to keep welfare expenditures around, but let them erode with inflation. You don't want to rip the rug out from underneath poor people. That's a good way to foment revolution. You want to make sure that as you build your economy, as you build an economy that creates prosperity, that creates wealth, that you keep protecting the poor in that, because otherwise you end up with this gap between, the poor coming off welfare and the economy doing well 5 or 10 years later. And you can't have that 5 or 10 years with an underclass that frankly has no support." So he was very careful to protect the poor. And he said, "Look, we don't want any tariffs because that's government intervention. We don't want any industrial planning, like we have in South Africa with the motor industry development plan. And, we've got master plans for like 10 different industries at the moment, where the government decides who gets to operate which factories where, and who gets tax breaks where, and which companies get protected by tariffs, and how much the tariff should be. This is basically the government picking winners. Milei didn't want any of that. He doesn't believe that the government has that capability, and he's quite right. He really is, theoretically, he is very strictly Austrian school in that sense. And that's what I really appreciate about him. That's what makes him so remarkable as a leader. I was not really that confident or that optimistic that Milei would succeed, because I also felt like Macri did, that change, that is too rapid. You're having to cut the civil service. The kind of resistance that you get from that. And we've got the same problem in South Africa. You mentioned cutting the civil service in South Africa, the resistance that you'll get from the unions and from popular protests and so on, and from opposition politicians. I really didn't think that Milei was going to be all that successful. I thought he was going to be brought down before he succeeded. And I was really pleasantly surprised to see that a lot of the economic indicators in Argentina within the first year were showing really, really good improvements. Inflation was coming down very, very fast. They came out of recession in the middle of last year, and they're now looking towards about 5 or 6% growth for 2025. Poverty, which initially rose above 50%, is back down to 38%, which is where it was before Milei took over. So, the risk that these austerity measures would increase poverty, it was there, and it happened, but it only happened briefly. And he's been able to turn that around as well. So there are a lot of good signs about the Argentinian economy. Look, it's early days, and a lot can still happen. A lot can still go wrong. It's years and years of sort of corrupt crony capitalism, which is what they had. It's very difficult to undo that. And Milei doesn't have a majority in the Congress either. In his their parliament, he doesn't have a majority there, so he has to push these things through very carefully with gathering allies and so on. But that's funny enough where he's really, really good. He, for years before his presidential campaign, he was sitting on podcasts and on television and on radio, explaining basic economics to people and saying why, the central bank was a problem. why printing money was a problem, why the government protecting certain industries, why that is a problem, why that doesn't work, and why, although even if you protect that industry, the cost to the rest of the economy is greater than the benefit that you get from that industry. He was really so good at explaining economics in basic and understandable terms, and I think that's why he's been very successful. So yeah, I'm watching Milei with great interest.
Yes, I think the whole world is watching that experiment, or not experiment, but to see what happens there. But the way you've described Milei, I probably wouldn't assign any of that to Donald Trump in the US as far as explaining economics to people and that sort of thing.
No.
I guess the only similarity I can see there is Trump seems to be going in with a heavy-handed approach to not do slow and incremental change, but let's try and do big change. However, having said that, I do understand that only about 14% of the US budget is actually discretionary spending. The rest is all falls under their entitlements and Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid, and military and all that sort of thing. So just as a quick comparison, how effective do you think this Department of Government Efficiency in the US is going to be in reducing the debt? Or do you think it's just a bit of cheap entertainment for the crowds while it's business as usual in the background?
Well, the principle, the thought is good. And I think maybe the intention is good. I'm not sure. I can't speak to what goes on in their minds. But, the idea of cutting government expenses and cutting government waste and cutting out government corruption is absolutely good. I love that. I want smaller governments. I don't want government to be involved in everything. A lot of things can be done privately that the government is doing at the moment. So the concept of a Department of Government Efficiency is great. I don't think that the way that they've gone about it is actually going to have any effect on government spending. And the last chart I saw actually shows that government spending is up compared to the same period last year. So, despite slashing, laying off a lot of people and slashing a lot of budgets, government spending has not come down. The budget proposals that are going through Congress right now, they show an increase in the public debt. He's not cutting debt, so this is not working. The problem is, yes, you need radical reform, and you need to go about it quickly because you need to gain the benefits of that reform before the voters become tired. Before the voters, because if you're going to give voters a tough time for a while, you need to make that as short as possible. So yes, you need to reform rapidly, but you also need to reform with some sort of strategy and some sort of theoretical sort of thinking behind it. You need a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. I know Milei campaigned with a chainsaw, and he gave that chainsaw to Elon Musk. But frankly, Milei wielded that chainsaw a lot more cleverly than Musk did. So no, I'm not sure that the US is going to succeed in that. And so, in principle, yes, I love the idea of cutting government, but I don't. You need to be a bit careful about what you cut and how you cut it. And I don't think they have been. And then, of course, there's the other side of it. That they have suddenly decided that trade deficits are a bad thing, and that tariffs are now a good thing and are going to save America. I'm going to make America great again, which I can explain the many ways in which that thinking is wrong. But you're right, Trump wouldn't be able to explain the economic theory behind it, and he hasn't. I understand where he wants to go. I understand what he's trying to do, but I understand it because I've read other people on the subject, and not because Trump can explain it. Trump couldn't finish a sentence while staying on topic.
Yes, that does sound pretty much how Trump speaks. The thing about trade deficits is sort of interesting to me as well, because, as I understand, obviously the US is the global reserve currency, which means everyone's trading in US dollars. The US also, I think from the 70s, started exporting their manufacturing base to China. So this is a 50-year process that we're looking at it now, but there's a 50-year period that this has been going on for. And if you are exporting all your manufacturing out of your country, surely you can't have there's going to be a trade imbalance. You will be a net importer of goods and services. Is that the thing that Trump is trying to correct? And how do you feel about that?
Well, look, there's a few things that Trump wants to correct. Trump doesn't like the fact that the dollar is strong. He wants it as a reserve currency because he knows that this is a huge benefit to America. But he wants the dollar to be weaker and wants other currencies to be stronger against the dollar in order to stimulate US exports and reduce US imports. He somehow views a country as if it's a personal budget. Right. In my case, if I spend more on goods and services than I earn, then I'm going to be in trouble. Then I'm going to be raising debt, and eventually I'm going to end up in a big hole of debt. And this is going to be a problem. Eventually, people aren't going to lend to me anymore, and they're going to come and take my furniture. A country doesn't really work that way, and it certainly doesn't work that way on the basis of imports and exports. Right? You could argue that a government budget works that way. Right? So a government budget shouldn't run into deficits because that raises the debt, and debt is inherently expensive. You're going to have to pay interest on debt, which you otherwise wouldn't have had to do. But imports and exports don't work that way. If you think about it, and I can't remember who said it now, he said, I have a great trade deficit with my barber. The guy never buys anything from me. And this is true. I go to the spa. I give the spa money all the time, right? And they never give me any money back. So I've got a huge trade deficit with them. Is that unfair somehow? Are they exploiting me? This is what Trump believes. Trump believes that if I give the spa more money than the spa gives me back, then the spa is exploiting me. It's taking advantage of me. And this is unfair. But what he doesn't count is the fact that I get things for that money. I get food, and I get groceries from this. I get value. I get things that I value more than that money from the spa. So I benefit from that. So even if a country doesn't export anything or doesn't buy any of America's exports, for the US to buy their exports nobody loses in that transaction. Both sides benefit. One gets money, one gets goods. Trump's mistakes are many, but so the principle that a trade deficit is necessarily bad is wrong. Right? A country that is very rich and generates a lot of its own prosperity can run a trade deficit, and this is a good thing. When you're creating things for export, you're really just working for someone else. You're working for another country. Right? What you get back for that is that currency that you earn with exports, you can then spend on imports. Imports are the goods and services. That's the stuff that makes you happy. That's the food and the technology and the consumables that make you happy. Money doesn't make anyone happy. It's what that money buys that makes them happy. So imports are a good thing, and exports are merely the price we pay to be able to afford those imports. Now, for a small country, especially with a currency that isn't a global reserve currency and not a very attractive currency, you absolutely have to export as much as you import because you have to earn that foreign currency. A country like America is in the enviable position that everyone wants their dollars, so they can buy in dollars from other countries, so they can import much more than they have to export. And that is a net benefit for the economy. Ultimately, what a consumer wants, I don't care where my car comes from, as long as I get the best quality for the lowest price. whether it's made in South Africa or made in Japan or made in Germany. It doesn't matter to me as a consumer. And that's really how you ought to look at it. What Trump also doesn't do, he doesn't count services in these trade deficits. He only counts goods. Now, as an economy develops, you become less and less reliant on agriculture, and then less and less reliant on manufacturing, and more on services and high tech. And in services and high tech, the US is still extremely strong, including in manufacturing. So the US is largely runs a trade surplus with the rest of the world in terms of services that they export. Where do you get your movies from? India? No. Right? Everyone gets their movies from Hollywood. This is a pure export that America, sends out to the rest of the world, makes billions out of it. So, not counting services in your calculation on trade deficits is a big mistake. Then the idea that a trade deficit somehow reflects a tariff that the other country is imposing, or a trade barrier that the other country is imposing on you, is also nonsense. It makes no sense. And the funny thing is, Trump he's even raised tariffs against countries with which America runs a trade surplus. So that just shows there's really nothing you can do to escape that 10% trade tariff from Trump. So none of this makes any sense from an economic point of view. Where it does make sense is, and Trump will use that word a lot, talks about leverage. It's basically a gun against the heads of other countries. So Trump now raises tariffs against other countries. And then he says, I saw this morning the headline, he says he wants to talk to 70 countries to isolate China in return for reducing tariffs. So he's basically raised tariffs as a gun against the head of other countries. He calls it leverage. Right? He thinks this is a great way to do a deal. It's basically extortion. He raises the tariffs as leverage so that when he wants something from these countries, he can go to them and say, look, I will reduce import tariffs from your country in return for you doing what we want. And whatever that might be, hand over Gaza so we can build a Trump hotel. Isolate China. Buy more things from America. Whatever, or build factories in America, whatever he decides he wants on a particular day, he can get in return for lowering those tariffs. But he has to have those tariffs in the first place as leverage. That's his strategy.
Okay.
I don't think it's going to work.
So it's not really about the tariff. It's more just a weapon. It's a tool to sort of get what you want.
Correct. And frankly, if anyone goes along with it and anyone agrees to Trump's demands in return for a lower tariff, they're idiots, because what stops Trump from raising that tariff again 5 years down the line when he wants something else from you, which is not in your interest, which you wouldn't have done otherwise? This is not negotiating a win-win, free market transaction. He's operating like a gangster. He's extorting people. It's a big protection racket.
Ivo, do you think we are seeing the end of the globalization movement where, at one stage everyone was exporting manufacturing to China, the EU was coming up and unifying Western Europe. You had the petrodollar system where Saudi Arabia agreed to only trade oil in US dollars. Now, as I understand, the Saudi agreement expired last year, and I don't think they've re-signed again. Issues with switching the Russia off the SWIFT global payment system and forcing them to find other ways to conduct trade. The COVID issue, just global shutdown, and no one can get anything because it all comes out of China. Do you think we're seeing the end of this massive nation states, these sort of birthing pains to a new world order, so to speak? Maybe something like what's mentioned in the sovereign individual, smaller nation states. What are your thoughts there?
Look, I don't think I don't think anything is firmly predictable yet, and partially because Trump changes his mind twice a week. It's which is also very bad for business, by the way. You're not going to build a factory if you don't know whether your tariff is going to be 10% or 100%. A year down the line, you can't invest on that basis. You can't do any sort of costing or business planning. So that's really bad for business. But so I don't know where Trump is going to go with this in the end. I do think that it's the end of America leading globalization. America was always the force. America created the World Trade Organization. America was always the one pushing countries to lower trade barriers and to engage in free trade, saying that this is good for America, but this is also good for the countries that lower their trade barriers. And it has been. That there have been amazing advances, amazing development in countries that have had low trade barriers and free economies. And there's a lot of data now to support that. So this has been a really successful sort of 60, 80-year project, the globalization project, the free trade project. I think America has just abdicated its leadership of that project. And this basically now puts the ball in the rest of the world's court and says, well, what are we going to do about it? A lot of people, I do see some retaliatory tariffs here and there, China notably. Europe has also talked about it. But I really think that this might galvanize the rest of the world and say, look, if America doesn't want to lead this, then we need to do this on our own. And we can't be led into a world with trade barriers, with no global trade, or much less global trade, just because, Trump is taking America its own way. So I'm hoping that the rest of the world will come together and say, look, as long as we keep our trade barriers low amongst us, then we'll do this without America, this globalization project. Look, it does have risks, and COVID showed that if your supply chains are too non-diversified, let me put it that way. If you have supply chains only to China, then you might have a problem with certain strategic goods and services. If you have foreign supply chains at all, they might be risky. So I understand a certain level of trade protectionism to secure national security interests, make sure that you've got enough of a food supply, even if global trade falls over. So I understand that there are risks, but I think what we need to do really is diversify our supply chains, and I think a lot of countries are quite aware of that. So I don't think that's necessarily what's going to break the free trade and globalization trend.
Okay.
What America wants to do, though, just quickly, what America wants to do is go back to an almost mercantilist system of great empires that compete against each other, and that each have their vassal states, like they had colonies back in the day, vassal states that have agreed to keep their currencies strong versus the US dollar, that have agreed to keep using the US dollar in international trade, and so on. So America will have its sphere of influence, its vassal states. China will have its sphere of influence, its vassal states. Maybe Russia will do. Europe will do. And we have those empires competing against each other rather than trading with each other. And that, to me, is taking the economy back 200 years. I don't think that that's a good thing. That's certainly not how we built the prosperity in the last 100 years. And I think it's going to be disastrous for the world.
Yeah, I agree. I read a nice little line the other day that said, when trade fails, war is soon to follow. And I suppose
Absolutely.
that's always a concern. If you can't trade, people need resources. And if you're not going to trade with them, they'll step in and try and take it and secure that.
Absolutely. That's why France and England and Holland were always at each other's throats back in the days of empire and the days of mercantilism. It was a win or lose situation. If you didn't claim those islands or that continent, then they would, and they would benefit from it. Whereas with free trade, you don't have that problem. With free trade, everyone can just buy what they need and specialize in what they want, and you end up with a far more peaceful world. And I think that all the data shows that free trade and free markets have given us that. Longer lifespans, more prosperity, less poverty, but also a lot more peace since the Second World War. And that's, I think people forget that. People think that things are bad. We're still living in probably the best time ever in history, even if some of the indicators are now pointing the wrong way.
Yeah, okay. So just on a slightly different topic, you're a tech background guy. You've written, researched, spent a lot of time in technology. What is your feeling towards this emerging freedom, for want of a better word, emerging freedom technologies where alternative social media platforms, for example, Twitter at one stage was criticized because they were pushing a certain agenda, or it felt like they were pushing an agenda. Companies have come up and tried to do something different. I know Blue Sky is one of them. Mastodon is something else. There's a new protocol called Nostr that's a sort of a decentralized messaging protocol at the moment. I think it's got potential for something else as well. What are your thoughts? I think you are active on Blue Sky, as I understand. What made you interested in trying a new technology?
Look, I haven't been particularly happy with the direction of X since Elon Musk took it over. It's the signal to noise ratio has become really poor. There's a lot of changes to the algorithm that frankly don't really sit well with me. So I'm on Blue Sky more as an experiment, see if I can build up a following base there that can rival my a follower base that I built up on Twitter over the last 18 years now. I joined in 2007, so pretty much all my followers are on Twitter. I've also played around a bit with Mastodon. The problem with a lot of these things is that they depend on the network effect. So it's if everyone is on X, then you have to be on X. If everyone's on Facebook, you have to be on Facebook. If you go to some new rival, well, then you're basically cutting your potential reach very dramatically, and a lot of people aren't going to be prepared to do that. Ultimately, I think I like the idea of a sort of an open, decentralized sort of system where there'll be areas with people of like mind sort of hang together, but it's all interoperable, and you don't have to be on one social network or another, just depending on you can be on whichever social network you want, but still communicate with everyone else. So I think the idea of Nostr and Mastodon and so on, I think it's very good. I'd like to see how that turns out. Sometimes these open source decentralized things do work out. Sometimes they don't, because there's just not enough money in it if you can't control it. So this is often a problem that holds back these sort of open decentralized technologies. But I like them in principle.
Yeah, I think network effect is probably the key thing that you've mentioned there. It's a bit like YouTube. Anybody else can go and build another YouTube client, but who's going to use it? YouTube is just the thing that everybody uses.
That's the thing. I mean, I went and I subscribed to what is the I can't even remember its name now. You see, that's what I mean. There's a paid for sort of video service that a lot of these YouTube creators they release their videos there first, and they this is a paid for thing, and this is how they try to build their revenue and try to become less dependent on YouTube. I don't think it's working. It's just too small. And the same with the other platforms. They either become politically very, very partisan and very polarized. So you have the far right, Rumble and Gab and so on. And on the far left, you have the same things. So they become very, very partisan and echo chamberish. Or they're just not big enough to, you just don't have the reach. So it's look, it's an interesting thing. It's these are natural monopolies in a way, and ultimately, if they don't serve the people well enough, then something will come up and eat their lunch. This might take 10 years, it might take 20 years, but we've seen that with a lot of tech companies that we thought that they were completely dominant, and then they weren't. IBM was completely dominant once; it isn't anymore. Microsoft was completely dominant once; it isn't really anymore. Yes, it still owns the desktop, perhaps, but it doesn't own server space. There's a lot. It doesn't own browsers. It doesn't. There's a lot that Microsoft doesn't own anymore.
I think,
and that's the market. That's the free market working. Chopping away at people once they start abusing their monopolies, then your days are numbered. Might take a few years, but someone will come and eat your lunch.
Yes, I think I remember Bill Gates saying his biggest failure was not recognizing mobile when it came up.
Yeah.
They were focused on laptop, desktop, and that sort of thing, and they missed mobile. They did try to get into it with Windows Phone, but it didn't really work.
Yeah, but they missed the internet as well. They were late to the internet party, and they were late to the mobile party. And once you're late to that party, then it's you can try. I mean, Google tried it with social media. I mean, how many social networks has Google tried to build over the years? It must be half a dozen. Yeah. None of them have taken off, despite the fact that Google is incredibly rich and powerful and has this big reach. If someone else is already delivering what you're trying to deliver, then why bother? And that they just didn't have any sort of value proposition that said this is why the Google social network is better than Facebook or better than Twitter. So that does keep social networks. I think that does keep companies on their toes, even if they have a natural monopoly. The threat that if they slack, then customers might end up revolting and go somewhere else.
Yeah, it's a beautiful example of the free market in action right there, you have to stay on your game or someone will come and eat your lunch, as you said. Ivo, we're coming up on time. I just wanted to ask, was there anything you wanted to cover that we haven't spoken about?
No, I think we've covered just about everything.
Okay,
it's been a really nice conversation, actually. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it as well. I've actually got a list of things that I wanted to ask you about. Some of them were, I know you write a lot about climate, and you mentioned the fracking thing and the Karoo, and I'm sure there's a lot of information that you have about that, and I'd love to chat to you about that as well. But I do want to keep it to the time as agreed, and I'll certainly reach out and look forward to having a follow-up conversation in the future about some of the topics we didn't get to talk about today.
Oh, that would be great. I'd really enjoy that.
Great. Well, I thank you for your time. Have a great day.
Yeah, sorry, you too, Gavin. Thank you.
Ivo, sorry. Yes. Before we go, can you tell the audience where they can connect with you and read your content?
Yes, on X, it's at Ivo Vegter, IVOVEGTER. And my name is on the script. There you go. Just copy it from there. And my columns are published on Tuesdays and Fridays, usually, if I deliver on time, at dailyfriend.co.za, which is a publication of the Institute of Race Relations.
Excellent. Thanks for that. Well, have a great day further, and I look forward to chatting in the future. Thank you, Ivo. Keep well.
Thanks, Gavin. Nice chatting.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.